Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first New York State Record Retention Law Conference, hosted by the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. My name is Matteo Bracco. I'm a digital technician here at MCSO, and I'll be running today's Zoom call. My apologies to anybody who planned on attending in person, but actually switching to Zoom has allowed us to have even more guests than expected. So records retention is an important part of how law enforcement operates on a daily basis. From how we manage our records to how long we hold on to body camera footage, it truly has a big impact on everything we do. That's why here at MCSO, we're glad to have this opportunity to help share this information relative to how exactly records retention law impacts law enforcement operations on a daily basis. Undersheriff, did you want to speak?
Sure. How you doing? So I'm Under Sheriff Brown with the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. You know, as we're constantly looking at record retention, as the laws change and, you know, how long we have to keep different records. And we have our two attorneys, Paul Simonelli and Kim Hinckley, doing research on how long we have to keep it. We just thought that if we had the question, many other people also have the question. So that's why we decided we wanted to do this. And luckily, we had Sarah Darling and Jennifer O'Neill that volunteered to come on today to really provide all the information behind it. You know, we really went to the expert and let them come on and share this information. So we're not guessing and we're not playing guessing games in our agencies, and we can just find out what we need to do. So we just want to say thanks for everybody that signed on. I think we have over 30 different groups that are signed on. So we're all looking forward to learning more about record retention.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Undersheriff. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to our distinguished speakers, Sarah Derling and Jennifer O'Neill from the New York State Archives. Thank you again for taking the time to speak to all of us today.
Thank you so much for having us. I really appreciate having this opportunity to speak with everyone. My name's Sarah Derling. I'm the Regional Advisory Officer covering Western New York for the New York State Archives. That means if you have records management questions, I'm your go-to girl. If you are having trouble finding something in the retention schedule, if you have questions about your record storage area, if you're looking to apply for one of our local government records management improvement fund grants, and you have questions, you can always ask me what to do. With me today, I have the head of our scheduling unit at the State Archives and Western New York native, Rochester area native, Jennifer O'Neill, who's going to be helping me present and talking about retention schedules and specifically the retention schedule items that are potentially of interest to you. So let me get my presentation up on the screen. Ta-da! So records management is one of those things that's important, and it's really critical for you to have in place and functioning well within your government organization. But it isn't the most exciting and the most thrilling. So today we want to help give you the information that you can use to build your programs, improve them, and specifically improve your records retention within your records management programs. And if you haven't already done so, get your pencil and paper out because we have a lot of information to give to you today. So here's just a short roadmap of where we are, where we're going, and how we're going to get there. We're going to start off by talking about some key records management concepts, so everybody's kind of on the same level playing field. And we all are working with the same information about what records management is and why it's important. And a lot of this information will be helpful to you to take back to your colleagues, particularly if you're getting any pushback on, well, why do we really need to have records management anyway? These are some reasons why it's important and why it's critical that you have that functioning program. Then we're going to talk about the records retention schedules themselves. We have our relatively new retention schedule, the LGS1. And Jennifer's going to walk you through how to use the schedule, what it is, what's important in it. And we're going to do a demo of how to use the schedule online. So we're going to be bouncing out of the presentation onto our website. At some point right around then, we're going to be taking a break. We have a couple of 5-minute breaks scheduled into the presentation. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about how to make this work within your program. How are you going to implement this, and how are you going to keep this momentum moving forward as you're implementing your records management program and managing your records retention? And then finally, we're going to have just a quick recap of the things that we've learned today. And without further ado, let's get on to it. So the universal truth about records management is that the records are not going to manage themselves. It's shocking, I know. The secret to a good records management program is actually making sure that you have the appropriate resources dedicated towards it. And it's not just, I have an RMO, but, records require time, attention, and resources, both financial and physical. In this section, we're going to go over the importance of records management and how it benefits you to have a good records management program. So starting off with some essential terms. The first one, record, is fairly straightforward. There are a lot of definitions, but the most important one comes to us from the Arts and Cultural Affairs Law. And that is that a record means any book, paper, map, photograph, or other information recording device, regardless of physical form or characteristic, that is made, produced, executed, or received by any local government or officer thereof pursuant to law or in connection with the transaction of public business. Records as used herein shall not be deemed to include library materials, extra copies of documents created only for the convenience of reference, and stocks of publications. The shorthand of this is any information created or received in the course of business, regardless of format, is considered a record. And when I say regardless of format, it doesn't mean, it means we don't care if it's paper, electronic, or it's a audio cassette that has been sitting in the back of the closet for 30 years. The information, we're more interested in the information on it. A record series is a group of records that have a like function that are normally filed together as a unit. So think about the records that you create in your work and what record series you might have. If you're in the fiscal department, you probably have receipts and annual reports. If you are dealing with equipment, you probably have records relating to the maintenance of the equipment, when it was purchased, any upgrades, that sort of thing. There's a lot of record series that you are potentially creating and working with in your everyday jobs. Records management as a whole is the systematic control of records throughout their life cycle. And that is to say, from creation to disposition or permanent retention, the records are being managed, they're being handled, they're being tracked as they're being created, used, and then put away for storage or destroyed. We're going to talk about the records life cycle, which is what that is basically, in just one more slide. And then the records manager is that person or professional who oversees the records management program and manages the records of your organization. Records management officers are often found in various positions, but they are in state law legally responsible for all of the decisions that are made for the records management program. In towns and villages, this is actually spelled out in state law that the records management officer, the one who is legally responsible for the records, is going to be your clerk. But for all other municipalities, they do have the ability to designate their own records management officer. It could be anyone that they want to designate that person. Typically, that person is usually in the main administrative offices. It's not always true. I've seen folks as records management officers in various positions throughout my career. But that person is able to delegate responsibilities to other departments as needed. So when it comes to the records life cycle, records go through a fairly standard set of phases. And it's important to be able to be managing those records throughout the life cycle as they're going through it. Records are created or received. So, you're sitting at your desk, you're typing up a report. you're creating a record. You may have received an email or report from an external source. That's the receipt of the record. As you're using it, that's the active records phase. You know, you're in and out of that file, you're accessing that record regularly. You know, you need to have it nearby your desk or on the network somewhere that you can easily access it. Once you no longer need it regularly, that moves it into the inactive records phase. And that's when you're going into the file every couple of months, but you're not using it like super regularly. It's safe to move it down the hall into a records room where you don't, you know, you have the time to go walk and get to it. And then the final disposition is after, you know, you've had the record, you've used the record, you've stored it for the appropriate amount of time legally according to the records retention schedule. You can dispose of the record by destroying it, or you can send it to archiving for long-term storage because it has historical or significant value to the government. And then the cycle starts all over again. It's important to be involved in all of these phases of the life cycle. It's easier to start managing records at the creation of the records or the receipt of the records. So if you know that a system is going into place and you know that it's going to be creating records, instead of having to figure out how to handle them in 5 years' time, make sure that you're involved in the development of that system or the processes and procedures that are going into creating these records so that they go into your records management program appropriately. You don't have to scramble to figure out where they are. And that's true through all phases of the life cycle. You know, it's never too late to figure out or too early to figure out how to manage those records. So when it comes to managing records, I did stress this earlier. Records management pertains to all records in all formats, including paper, microfilm, electronic records, AV records, your VHS videotapes, your 16mm rolls. It doesn't matter what format they're on. What we focus on is what the content of the record is. And records management involves the care of the records throughout their life cycle and retention period. Properly managing records requires the involvement of everyone in your government. It's not strictly the records management officer's responsibility to manage these records because they're not the only one creating records. They're not the only one holding on to records while they're being used in the active phase. Records management is everybody's responsibility. So, anybody sitting at a desk who has records is responsible for making sure that they're, creating them and storing them appropriately until such time as they can be handed off to inactive or permanent storage or destruction. It is really important that management also support these efforts as you're managing these records. And I can't stress this enough, honestly. It's a program that doesn't have management support is not going to go very far, unfortunately, because management is where you're going to get the authorization to implement new rules, policies, procedures on how to manage these records. They're going to help you get the resources you need to do so. So you really want to make sure that you have management support as you're going to be moving forward managing these records. To that end, you really want to make sure that you're your own best cheerleader, and that you're talking up your program to them and showing them why it's important and why you need to have their involvement, their staff's involvement, and the resources to manage those records appropriately. Effective records management begins when a record-keeping system is being designed and continues over time. As we said, records lose their active value. They become inactive, you don't use them very often, and end up sitting in storage for a while you try to figure out, how long you need to hold on to them and what the appropriate disposition for them is. Ideally, the design or creation of a record should anticipate the retention that you're going to have for it. So, like I was saying earlier, if you're putting in that electronic system, how long are you going to, what records are going to be in it? How long are you going to need to maintain those? And, how are they being stored? Ideally, you're going to be having them in a non-proprietary format because it'll be easier to manage them over the long term. Because records with long-term retention value need to be accessible for the long-term retention period. So why is records management essential? There are a lot of really good reasons for having records management. And what we have on the screen is just kind of the high points. So we're going to talk about all of these individually. But you want to make sure that you are trying to do the best to maintain a program that is going to represent your government well, is going to make sure that the information that you're creating, the records that you're creating, are accessible and locatable for the duration of the retention period. You want to think about records as a valuable asset. They are one of the most valuable ones that you are going to have within your organization. And records management programs are going to be what supports your institutional memory and institutional history over time as well. So there is a legal mandate for properly managing records. There's a system of laws and regulations that mandate each local government and state agency institute a program for the efficient and orderly care of the records that they're creating as a result of conducting government business. So there's the Arts and Cultural Affairs Law, there's the Local Government Records Law, there's the Commission of Regulations, there's FERPA, there's FOIL, there's HIPAA, there's the FCRP, Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, that all play into making sure or form a framework for managing your records. The laws and regs that are probably going to be most immediately pertinent to you are the Local Government Records Law, because these are the ones that establish your responsibilities in managing and maintaining your records, and how you should designate a records management officer and other critical aspects of establishing your program and maintaining your records. Other laws, FOIL is another big one that I'm sure everybody is dealing with. You know, you're getting your FOIL requests that you have to be able to locate your records and provide access to them quickly and competently. With the exception of the folks who are working for you, your records are probably going to be your most valuable asset and really should be treated accordingly. If you don't manage your records appropriately, it can cause a lot of problems. The loss of a record could affect your ability to complete contracts, enforce laws, and otherwise just kind of hinder the daily work of the government, the work that you're doing within your government. Think about whether or not you can do your job without having records. You know, what systems, what records are you touching every day that you need to know where they are, that you need to know how to access so that you can appropriately do the work that you need to do. Records also may have different values depending on what they are. So some records are going to support proper decision-making. You know, they are provide you with information that you need to make decisions to properly perform your job. They may support the fiscal aspects of your local government by, talking about revenue collection and paying employees and vendors so that you can do these things appropriately. Because nobody wants to work without getting a paycheck, you know, folks? Record support contracts and agreements. If you have a contract in place or you have an agreement in place, you can have the records, the paperwork to back that up. And records can have historical value. You know, look at the records you have in your collection, and what's the value behind them? What do they do to support the institutional memory of your government? So records management programs are kind of like insurance in some ways. You invest in insurance to protect the organization from loss, and you should invest in records management for a lot of the same reasons. Your government needs the records to provide improved compliance and that you're conducting business properly. We live, I'm sure you're aware, in a society where people like to sue. It's very litigious, and we need records to prove that we're not being negligent, that we are doing the things that we are supposed to do and we're doing them appropriately. If records can't be produced, it can open you up to unnecessary risk and lead to fines and, in extreme cases, imprisonment. So you need to make sure that you are appropriately managing your records to reduce the risk associated with not having them or not being able to locate them, as well as to demonstrate that you are making the appropriate decisions, you are doing work appropriately. You have needs to respond to discovery requests, and say somebody foils you. If you don't manage your records appropriately, you've just got stacks and stacks of records sitting in a records room somewhere, the boxes are about to tip over on your head, and you have to find that one single record that they're looking for. How long is it going to take you? And what are the risks that you won't find those records? We have our local government records management improvement fund, which is a program where we give out money to local governments who apply through the program to manage their records. And one of the things I see as stated as a problem year after year after year in the grants is that folks spend hours on hours in unorganized records rooms trying to find records. They cost them a ton of time, it costs them a ton of money. The staff is, who should be doing other things, are stuck in the records room, or which is in the basement somewhere, and it's dark and there's all sorts of creepy crawlies down there. And they may not find that record at all. And that puts a lot of egg on their face in a lot of ways. If you've got a FOIL request that doesn't look good, if you can't provide that record, depending on who's asking, that can be a problem. That could get you, rise to a level of public awareness. If a TV station is looking for something, or a particularly contentious member of the public is looking for something and starts blasting on Facebook that, hey, I went looking for this and they don't have these records. How does that make you look? And how does that, what sort of risks does that introduce to your records management program? So making sure that you are taking the appropriate steps to manage your program to reduce the risk of not having records. And I'm talking largely at this point just about your public perception. What happens if you can't find a contract and the contract's disputed? What are the risks associated with that? There are a lot of risks that can be associated with poor records management. So you want to have a good program to mitigate them as best possible. Sorry, I got away from myself on there. As you can tell, that's a topic I like to talk about. Good records management also promotes government accountability. Governments need to prove to the citizens that it supports that it is operating in an efficient, trustworthy, and legal manner. And your records can help the government prove that it does, or help citizens prove that it isn't and look for ways to solve that problem. There are a lot of things that it does. It documents the government activity. What is your government doing? What is your organization doing? How are they doing it? What is the historical background on what they've been doing? It helps to preserve citizens' rights. Many of our rights rely on documents that have been created or filed with governments, and being able to find and locate them as needed is important. It helps create that institutional memory. What has your government done? What cool things have you done? One of the things that I remember most about being a kid in school, because my nieces just went back to school this week, is the Officer Friendly program. Officer Friendly came into our classroom to talk to us, and that was the most exciting thing. How many of you have had the Officer Friendly program and preserved the records related to that? What were your outreach efforts, and what cool things did you do with that? So there, that institutional memory is part of those records that you're creating and preserving and managing appropriately. It helps, create that institutional memory for governments, which help it operate efficiently and function well. It could be that it documents the history of how you've spent money on particular projects or what you've investigated. 5 years ago, we wanted to do this project. We did a report on it. We looked at all these topics and we said, it doesn't work for us. And now we've got somebody coming in and they want to do the same thing. Do you have to rerun that entire project, or can you look back to that report from 5 years ago and say, these are the reasons it didn't work for us now? If any of these have changed, we may be able to revisit that. But if these are still the same problems that we're facing with this project, we still can't do it, which can save you time and money in having to deal with that. But also, if you have a disaster, we've had a lot of rain come through upstate recently, and there's been a lot of flooding. If you have a records disaster, a good records management program will identify your essential records, the records that you absolutely need to have in order to keep functioning, so that if your building becomes impassable or records get damaged, you can triage on what's the most important records to get out of there so that you can continue functioning appropriately. And in many cases, it can help preserve the heritage of the population in your community. So records management can save you time and money, because time is money, honestly. And records management can do that by improving program efficiency and improve business processes and workflows. So we've got a bunch of points on the slide. Easier access to the records. So you've managed your records appropriately. You've gone through them with a retention schedule. You've disposed of the things that you don't need to have. You only have the records that you need to have. They're organized well. That means that they're easier to find. You don't have to search through boxes and boxes of records and try to hope you can find the right record in them. And you know where those records are located. That box is well labeled. So it takes you 5 minutes to find the record that you're looking for instead of 3 hours. Managing them well can help you figure out what can be disposed of. If you've got boxes appropriately labeled, files appropriately labeled, what the retention schedule item is for them. So when you have a 6-year fiscal record, you can go and find the box of records from what years it is, 2021. So you can find the box of records from 2014 that is 6-year fiscal records, pull those out and dispose of them very easily, as opposed to having to sort through 16 boxes of miscellaneous records to find all of the fiscal records that you can dispose of. It makes them easier to manage because you have a system, you have a routine. Records go here, they're not here, 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 and here. They're in one location. So you can go get them, they're organized, they're in shelves. It makes it so much easier to access them. And by doing that, it improves your service to constituents who need access to those records, or you as you're providing services to your constituents as you're in need to access those records. Instead of waiting an hour for somebody to come up with the record that you need to respond to a call or answer a question somebody submitted to you, you can get that record in 5 minutes because you know where they are and they're well organized. And by managing those records, it can also save you money, because if you're not keeping everything, if you're not keeping all of your paper, if you're not keeping all of your electronic records, and electronic records, folks, are getting to be really critical, you're not spending the money on the storage space for them. So, if you're renting storage space, you're using Iron Mountain, or you have, electronic cloud storage space, you're paying for the space that you're using. So if you get rid of the things that you don't need, you're not paying for them anymore. If you have storage on site, you're using a records room, maybe you can reduce your records storage space to a smaller room, or make it much more efficient that way. Or if you are storing your electronic records on your own servers and you're starting to run out of space on the server and might have to buy another one, maybe managing those records and disposing of the records that you no longer need can save you from buying a server for a year at least, because you can free up the space on that server. It reduces the volume of records, it improves efficiency, and again, time is money. So you've got a clerk who has to go find a record for you, and they're getting paid what? Let's just go with the baseline of $15 an hour. if they spend an hour looking for those records, it's $15. It's been that they've spent looking for a record in a record storage room. Whereas, if they only spend 5 minutes looking for the record, they haven't spent $15 looking for the record. They spent just a fraction of that, and they can get back to doing other work and other activities that may be of as much or more value to you. So, and that's when you're talking about a clerk. I've seen folks who are in fairly high positions throughout governments who spend ridiculous amounts of time looking for records, and it's $25, $26, $30 an hour looking for records. That's probably not the best use of their time or the best use of your money. So having well-organized records makes them easier to access, saves you time, saves you money, and makes you look better for the government because you can respond to the public, because you can respond to their needs faster. And hey, we're getting into retention schedules. So Jennifer, would you like to take it over from here?
Great, thank you, Sarah. And Sarah is going to advance the slides for me. So thank you. So you can go to the next slide. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about records retention and disposition schedules in general, and then we will look at our own local government schedule, the LGS-1, and just take a look at some specific items that pertain to law enforcement and to your organizations in general. So records retention and disposition schedules are a really important tool in terms of records management. And let me first just define what they mean. So basically, a retention and disposition schedule is a list of record series titles that indicates the minimum length of time to maintain each record series and what should happen to them once the retention period has been met. So that's a lot to unpack. So let's look at each of those components and pull it apart. So first, it's a list of record series titles. And as Sarah explained, a record series is a group of records that have the same function, and they generally have the same retention period. So we're talking about employee time records, that would be a record series. Purchasing files would be a series, even though there may be a bunch of different types of documents like bills or receipts that might make up that series. Case investigation record, prisoner food services records, personnel case files, those would all be examples of record series. And the retention schedule indicates the minimum length of time to maintain each series. So let me take a step back and just say that the New York State Archives has authority over the retention and disposition of local government records, including county records and records of county sheriff's offices. We provide this authorization to destroy or dispose of records through the issuance of retention schedules, and specifically for local governments, that's through the LGS-1 schedule. To determine what the minimum retention periods should be for record series, we work with local governments. We also work with oversight agencies, and they are really helpful in identifying records for us and pointing us to requirements that may exist. So we do a lot of research. It often involves a lot of legal research because we look at state and federal laws and regulations and policies. Those are great if they specifically spell out how long a record needs to be kept. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So we also look at audit requirements, and this is particularly for fiscal records. the state comptroller's office normally tells us that fiscal records need to be kept a minimum of 6 years to meet their audit requirements. So that's why you'll see a 6-year retention period for a lot of your fiscal records. We also look at what are the legal evidence needs for records. So we'll look at statutes of limitations involving records. So particularly for case investigation records that you may have in law enforcement, we look at the statute of limitations for that are part of criminal procedure law. And those are really great because it spells out how long the statute of limitations is for prosecuting for misdemeanors and felonies, and it spells out a specific period of time. So that's great. That is right there, the minimum retention period that those records need to be kept. Most often we set retention periods based on administrative needs. This is usually because there isn't anything in law or regulations, or it's not a fiscal record. So it really boils down to how long does a local government need to keep a record in order to fulfill its business needs. We also look at secondary use. So does the record have long-term historical value or researcher value and should be kept permanently? So we may mark records in the retention schedule with a permanent retention, or you'll see that sometimes we put a note that encourages local governments to consider certain record series for long-term historical use. So just to reiterate, the retention schedule lists the minimum retention period. You do not have to dispose of that record when the minimum retention period is up. You may have reasons which you should document for keeping records longer. We don't encourage you to keep records longer unless you have a really compelling need to do so. And we're going to talk about there are some specific instances where you must keep records longer than the retention period. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about the last component of the definition of a retention schedule. It indicates what should happen once the retention period has been met. And as Sarah pointed out in the life cycle diagram, there's really two options. Either a record is destroyed or it is archived. So archiving can mean putting it in your records room and keeping it permanently, or it could mean sending it to the county archives, for instance. So let's circle back to, there are certain situations that you cannot destroy records, even though the retention period says, the retention schedule says that you can, and you have met the retention period. And those cases would be if there is a pending or imminent legal proceeding involving your government. So that could include a subpoena. It could include that you receive a notice of claim of a pending lawsuit, or it could be a FOIL request. The other instance is if you have an audit of your organization. So for both legal proceedings and audits, you have to hold on to the records. You have to suspend that retention period until whatever legal or audit action has been wrapped up and completed. If you have records that were created before 1910, you need to seek additional authorization from the state archives to dispose of those records. So contact Sarah if you run across any of those, and she can give you instructions on how to seek authorization for those records. And, you know, we have a 1910 date. As you may know, a lot of records for state government were destroyed in the 1911 state capitol fire. So we've used that as kind of a good cutoff, you know, for any historic records that predate the fire. It's a good idea for us to just do a double check to make sure that those records aren't really important records that need to be kept longer. If a record is not included in the retention schedule, please let us know. We rely on local governments to let us know where there are gaps in our schedule. We may be able to find a schedule item to fit the record that you're looking at, but it may also indicate that there is a gap in our schedule. If you have a record that's not scheduled, you have to hold on to it. You know, keep in mind, you can't dispose of records unless we've authorized their destruction. And so that means that if they're not in the retention schedule, you need to hold on to it. We do have a process by which you can seek temporary authorization to destroy records that aren't scheduled. So again, if you run across those, get in touch with Sarah and she can walk you through the process. And then I mentioned that there are going to be cases where you decide that certain records that may be scheduled for destruction, you feel have historical value to your organization. And that may very well be the case. You know, we can't necessarily account for every instance where a record might document some historical happenings within a local government. So use your discretion and judgment to identify those records that you think may have some unique historical value. Next slide, Sarah. So why should you use a schedule? Well, we've touched on some of these concepts, but basically a retention schedule ensures that you keep records as long as you're required to do so for administrative, legal, and research purposes. It also tells you when you can destroy records or dispose of records, and then you can legally destroy those records once the retention period is up and you no longer need them. Because you can dispose of records or destroy records, you're going to reduce the volume of records, which, as Sarah pointed out, is going to improve your records retrieval because you have fewer records that you need to look through. You're also going to save money on staff time to have to go through a large quantity of records if you're only saving those records you need to. You're also going to save money on storage space because you'll be able to legally dispose of records and free up space for new records that you're creating. The retention schedule will identify those permanent or historical records so that you can make sure that you have properly place those records in an environment that has good temperature and humidity controls and is using non-acidic materials to package it in if it's a paper record, Or if it's an electronic record, you're making sure that you're constantly migrating it to a new format before you lose access to it, so that you ensure that it is properly preserved. And hopefully, because you've done all of these things, it's going to make your work easier. And I think that's something that we all strive for. Next slide. So here are some basic tips for navigating our retention schedules, and specifically the LGS1. So I think we've emphasized enough that the record series is really the key to unlocking records management and retention schedules. So you need to figure out first what the record series is. Once you've done that, determine whether you're dealing with the official copy of that series. So the retention schedule covers the official copy. Any other copies that you have are likely going to be considered reference copies or non-records, and you can simply dispose of those when you no longer need them. So an example of this is your human resources office is going to hold the official copy of each employee's personnel file. You may supervise some employees, and you may have your own copy of some of your employees' personnel files. The human resources copy is going to be the official copy. They're going to follow the personnel case file retention schedule item and destroy their records accordingly. You as the supervisor, you hold a reference copy, so you can destroy your copies when you no longer need them. So probably you'll hold on to them until the staff person leaves or until that record is obsolete. We've organized the LGS1 into functional groupings, and they should have headings that reflect those functions. So if you're looking for purchasing files, you're going to look under the fiscal section. If you're looking for law enforcement related records, you're going to look under the public safety section. This can help you narrow down where your record series can be found within the schedule. If you like using the paper copy of the schedule, and we do have paper copies available, just let us know and we can mail one to you. We do have an index in the back where you can look up a record series. I would really encourage you to check out our website, and Sarah's going to give you a demo of it in a little while. But we have a really great new tool that allows you to search across the retention schedule on our website. So it's great. You can plug in some keywords, and I found it really helpful to be able to quickly find what I'm looking for. We also have copies of the retention schedule available in other electronic formats, including PDF, a database, and a spreadsheet. So you could also search by keywords across those formats as well. If you can't find what you're looking for, please contact us. Start with Sarah. If Sarah's stumped, she'll contact me. But it could be an indication, as I mentioned earlier, of we don't have the item in our schedule yet. So, let us know so we can make sure that we add it to the next version. Next slide. So you have your retention schedule and you've identified the record series. That record series is going to tell you what the final disposition of that record should be. If it's permanent, it goes to your archives, whatever that may be, or it could say destroy. So you would destroy it. The retention schedule does not outline the method of destruction. So that's something that you as an organization is going to need to figure out and document in your policies and procedures. So you may decide, and I think this is a good policy, that if the record contains information that's confidential or information that's sensitive, that if it was thrown out in the dumpster, might put a bit of egg on the face of your organization, that a good policy would be to shred those records. So that's really something that would be good to include in your policy. Determine which is the official copy, and we talked about this in a previous slide. If there is a question over who holds the official copy, and just to make sure everyone's on the same page, it's a good idea to include that in your policy and procedure to make sure that disposition's carried out appropriately. One thing that we should really emphasize is to be consistent in carrying out disposition of your records. So, you know, you really need to regularly and consistently dispose of your records. If you have a good records management program in place, you will be making sure that regular disposition occurs. You don't want to be caught in a situation where you haven't regularly destroyed your records and you have a hint that a legal action is going to be taken against your organization, and all of a sudden you start throwing out records. That doesn't look good. The court could infer from that you were destroying records because you knew that there was incriminating evidence in them. So it's really important to regularly carry out disposition of records per the retention period in the retention schedules. One thing that organizations have done is they have an annual disposition day. So that might be something that you consider. It's important to document disposition. We do have a sample disposition form available on our website that you're welcome to use. This allows the records management officer to keep track of what records have been destroyed. And this could be good proof for a court that you destroyed records legally and you were destroying them regularly. If you need any help on establishing any of these policies and procedures, you need us to point you to our sample form, let us know. I am.
All right.
So let's look at the LGS1. So we published this in August 2020, so just last year. Many of you were probably familiar with and using the CO2 schedule, the schedule for county records. This supersedes the county schedule, the CO2 schedule, and it superseded it on January 1st of 2021, so just this past year. So you have to adopt the LGS1 even if you were using the CO2. So make sure that your organization has adopted the LGS1. And then once you've adopted it, you can go ahead and start applying those retention periods. Next slide. So these are some issues that arise with law enforcement agencies, and we were asked specifically about these questions for a previous presentation that we gave to municipal police departments. So we figured we'd keep this slide in there, and because we figure that you probably have similar questions. So one question dealt with sealed records, and we get this question a lot. How long do I retain sealed records? So as you know, there's certain cases in which you need to seal records. The fact that the records are sealed and access to information is restricted really has no effect on the retention of the records. You would simply follow the normal retention periods outlined in the LGS1. So for example, probably the most common type of sealed record is for investigations involving an adult where no offense was committed. And that retention period is 5 years. So you would seal the record and hold on to it for 5 years, after which you can destroy it. We were also asked about digital evidence. So records that you create for administrative purposes during the normal course of business may be used as evidence in a legal proceeding. You should create every record as if it could potentially be used for legal reasons, but only those that actually become evidence must go through additional stringent evidence protocols as outlined by the New York State Department of Criminal Justice Services, or DCJS. So first, let's talk about creating legally admissible digital records. Under existing federal and state rules of evidence, local governments can use records produced by automated information systems, things like cameras, computers, breathalyzers, radar, to meet record keeping requirements, provided that the records are created in the normal course of business and their authenticity and reliability can be established. So establishing their authenticity and reliability depends on the accuracy of the process or system used to produce the record, the source of the information in the record, and the method and time of its preparation. So by carefully planning for new information systems, developing proper policies and procedures, establishing controls to monitor the accuracy and authenticity of data, and training staff, you can take advantage of the many benefits of new information technologies while limiting the risk that their records will be lost, corrupted, or challenged. For records that will be used as evidence in legal proceedings, whether created internally or received from an external source, there are additional requirements that must be followed to maintain the integrity of the data to make sure it's authentic and reliable. For law enforcement agencies that are accredited through the New York State Law Enforcement Accreditation Program, they should follow the protocols for evidence and non-agency property management as outlined in the Standards and Compliance Verification Manual. So it's important that staff regularly destroy law enforcement records according to the LGS1. So this includes policies and procedures, correspondence, body camera footage, all kinds of different things. This is By following these retention schedules, this will reduce your legal risk and improve your efficiency in retrieving records needed to do your work and respond to requests. So having a retention schedule that is properly followed serves as a legally satisfactory explanation as to why those documents could not be produced. And as we mentioned, you need to suspend retention and destruction of the records if you do get potential litigation or ongoing litigation. Another question that we have gotten quite a bit is, how long do I keep text messages, email, social media, etc.? So any of those records created using work issued or personal accounts that are made during the course of work are records or could be considered records. And as such, they need to be managed in accordance with approved retention schedules. Some of these may not be considered records because you'll find that oftentimes they duplicate information found and retained elsewhere, and they're going to have very little legal, fiscal, or administrative value. Keep in mind that these are all means of communication or a format and not a record series. So you're not going to find an item in the LGS-1. And as Sarah mentioned, we look at the content of records. So we would look at the content of each of these various different types of formats to determine what is the appropriate record series in the LGS-1. Now, one thing is that a lot of organizations use a cloud or social media provider to provide some of these services. So they're at the mercy of those providers as to how long those retention periods are, and they can really vary depending on who your provider is. So you may want to try to work with that provider to keep records, long enough according to the retention schedule, or you may need to figure out some sort of other solution to maybe copy those records onto your own network or somewhere so that you can preserve them long enough. But you may also look at them and find that many of them are not considered records because the information is maintained elsewhere. In terms of forensics lab records, you will not find items in the public safety of the LGS-1 that are specific to law enforcement forensic labs. Instead, you can use the items in the public health section, and you'll find within that section a laboratory section. And you can use those items in that section to cover your lab records. In terms of law enforcement disciplinary records, we've gotten a number of questions recently about this. There's no item in the LGS-1 specific to disciplinary records of law enforcement personnel. So instead, you should use the standard investigation records and disciplinary proceedings item, which is item 637, and the personnel records item in the personnel section of the LGS-1. So you would just use the normal personnel records items to cover law enforcement personnel records. And I didn't put it on, it's not appearing on the slide, but related to disciplinary records are the use of force reports. So these are the reports that need to be filed with DCJS. And you can use the law enforcement reports item, part D, which covers incident-based reports or queries, and it has a 3-year retention period. That's item 1221. And if instances of use of force are further investigated and heard before a citizen review board, then they would be covered under that investigative records and disciplinary proceedings item in the personnel section that I just mentioned. All right, next slide. So going back to the specifics of the LGS1, when we updated it last year, like we usually do, any new items or items that we made major revisions to, we applied a diamond symbol next to the number so that people can be made aware that changes were made to the item or that it's new. You may see a diamond symbol next to an item, but we may have only changed a sub item. So, you know, the extent of the revision can vary from item to item. You will notice that we provided a cross-reference to old schedule numbers. So if you were familiar or you've kept a list of the CO2 schedule numbers, you can look up that CO2 number and find the new item number in the LGS1. And we also have a spreadsheet that has all this information in it. So if you have this schedule information in a database or a spreadsheet and you need to update it with the new LGS1 numbers, we've provided some resources that will help you to do that. If you don't see any old numbers listed and you also see a diamond symbol, that's a key that this was a new item that we added to the schedule. Next slide.
All right, we are going to demo the schedule. Everybody's excited about this, right? This is honestly one of my favorite parts. So let's share our website. Dun, 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 dun. This is the State Archives website. And I highly recommend, if you haven't been here before, that you write down that URL, because this is going to be really helpful to you in terms of managing your records. There's a lot of really good information here, and not just more in the section I'm going to show you, but a couple other places. One thing to note is that we are going to be doing some minor revisions of the website coming up soon. So you really do want to make sure that you are following along and hitting the links that I'm telling you to now, unless you want to figure it out on your own coming up soon. So to get to the retention and disposition schedules, we are going to go to the Managing Records link. We are going to go down to the drop-down paid item for retention and disposition schedules and click that. Next, this is our retention disposition page. A lot of good information here. Publication 41 goes over a lot of the retention information that you need in terms of managing your records within your program. But we're going to scroll down a bit because we're looking for the LGS1. If you have not, your government has not yet adopted the LGS1 and you need a model resolution form, there is one on the website right here. You can download that and use it to base yours off of. But we're still going down. Here's the link in the heading for the new local government schedule. Here is the itty bitty link for the LGS1. We're going to click on that. This is the page I personally have bookmarked. I highly recommend that when folks get to this page, they bookmark this page, because this is the one that has all of the information about the LGS1 on it that's going to be useful to you. As we scroll down the page, we have some information about the schedule. On the sidebar, this is where we have the online version of the schedule, the searchable version of the schedule. And I will show you how to do that in just a second. If we keep scrolling down, there's a section that says available formats. First one is the web resource. That's the one that we are going to do the online searching on. The second one is the printable PDF. And we are going to open that up real quick. You can download this to your desktop and use it to find retention schedule items. If you need a paper copy and you cannot wait for us to mail you a copy because you have to request it first, and then the US Post Office has to send things, and we all know how that's been lately. You can download this and print it. It will print up just fine. You can hole punch it, stick it in a binder, and stick it in your records room in case you have questions. This has all of the same information as the online version. It is keyword searchable. So I can, I'm assuming everybody's on PCs, Control F. It'll bring up a little search box and I can type in video. And it will bring up any item that the word video shows up in. So I can just kind of bounce through until I find the one that I'm looking for. This may not be the most efficient way of using this schedule for folks, but it is one way to keyword search it. If you have the paper copy of this, you know, you've printed off the paper version, my favorite thing to do, so let's just do this, is to use the index in the back. I think Jennifer just talked about this already. This is my favorite way of using the paper schedule. I don't even, unless I know what section it's in, I go straight to the index. I look up the term that I'm looking for. And one of the things you want to keep in mind is that the schedule is written in legalese. So what you call something may not necessarily be what it's called in the schedule. So you want to think a little laterally sometimes, you know, if you're looking for receipts, you may want to look for vouchers, that sort of thing. But you can look up whatever you're looking for in the back. It'll tell you what page it's on and what item numbers you're looking at, or item pages it's on and item numbers that you're looking at for that term. And you can go right to that page and find things. I like this for the paper version. I definitely have used this a lot, standing in somebody's records room. Well, there's somebody up on a ladder calling down records down to me and I'm looking things up in the schedule. So that's the PDF. It's pretty helpful. It's pretty handy. I like it a lot. We have a MS Copy, an Access database. You know, if you are good with Microsoft Access, you want to use it to, you know, manipulate the schedule to build your own, you know, office schedules. Jennifer's going to talk about those in a bit. This database is great for downloading and doing that with. And we have some instructions for it. We also have some Excel worksheets here that are lists of the new items in the schedule. There are crosswalks between the old schedules, it's LGS1 crosswalk. So you know what your old numbers are. I don't think it's going to come up if I try to open it. You know what your old numbers are on the schedule. You can download the crosswalk, look it up in the CO2 column and look across to the LGS1 column and it'll tell you what the new LGS1 number is. So that can make it really easy for you to update your various files and office schedules if you have them. So these are all pretty cool. Take a look at them, you know, see what you can do with them. But my favorite thing that we have implemented with the new LGS1, my favorite thing in the whole wide world, folks, is this searchable schedule function. I go to this page, I hit search the schedule. It comes up with a search window. I type in, let's look for video again, video. Say I'm looking for body worn camera footage. I type in video. I hit apply and it brings up everything that the word video pops up in. And admittedly, there's some stuff that I'm probably not going to be interested in, you know, general administration, childcare stuff. Not what I'm looking for if I'm looking for body worn camera footage. But everything's up on the screen. So if I scroll down to the section that I know it's supposed to be in, which is going to be public safety, there it is right there, item 1280. Recordings taken from mobile and stationary units, not including but not limited to vehicle cameras, body worn cameras, and video surveillance footage. It's really, really easy to do. It's really, really simple. So let's say we are, we're looking for the video or audio recordings of booking ORS proceedings processing that we had to use, we knew the old number for the CO2, so it's 958. I'm gonna explain that better in just a second. I know what the old number is. I'm going to plug in 958. I'm going to hit apply. It's going to pull up any item that 958 appears in. What we want to do is focus on that previous schedules item. It's going to show up here, CO2 958, and bring up that item specifically. The nice thing about this is you've got the title, you've got an identification of whether it's a major revision or new. So if there's a star in that box, that means it's been updated or it's brand new. It tells you what the new schedule item is, and it tells you what all of the old schedule items are. And this is my tip. If there is nothing in previous schedules, that means it's a brand new item. I know that seems very obvious. It took me a hot minute to click to that, so I just want to share that to people so they don't struggle like I did. I love this thing a lot. You know, all of these headings on the side are clickable. You know, I can go straight to public safety if I want. I click on that. It will bring up everything in the public safety section, all the subcategories. If I just want to look at a specific subcategory, personal property, let's say, I can click on that and it's just the items of personal property. Let's go back a little bit. So I've got my search window up. I've pulled up, this is also pretty cool. I like this a lot too. I'm sharing a lot of information at you folks, but I really want you to love this as much as I do. You know, I find an item, I want to see what else is in the same section of it. This is a clickable link right here. I can click on law enforcement miscellaneous, and it'll bring up everything that's in law enforcement miscellaneous. So if I see something that I think is close but not right, and I figure it's probably in the same section, I can click on that link. It'll bring up everything. I don't have to go searching off the side. I love this a lot. I hope you love it as much as I do. One other thing I want to show you before I throw this back to Jennifer is I want to show you workshops, because workshops has got a lot of really good information for you guys. If you click on workshops, if you go to webinars, we have all of these pre-recorded webinars. Most of them are about an hour on all sorts of records management topics. They're all out on YouTube. Not that it's linked right there, where you can watch these in your leisure. You know, you've got nothing to do at lunch, you're stuck at your desk, you want to spend your time learning about records management. You can go out here, hit a link, watch a video on a topic that's of interest to you. There's a whole mess of them. So please take the opportunity to take a look at our website. It's pretty awesome. And now we're going to go back to the presentation.
All right, thanks, Sarah. So we are going to look at some specific major revisions that occurred within the public safety section. So these are new items or major revisions to existing items that now appear in the LGS 1. So one of the things we did was we updated references to the eJustice New York Integrated Justice Portal, which is the system that replaced essentially NYSBIN. So that was a necessary update to make. We also added a new item for supplemental information on persons and places used for E911 or CAD. So basically, if you maintain information on, you know, are there handicapped persons in the residence? Are there dangerous animals? Are there specific hazards relating to a building? Those would be captured under this new item. We work with DCJS staff to update the accreditation records item. It used to have a permanent retention period, and we heard from people that they thought that was too long. We and DCJS agreed, and we came up with a retention period of 10 years for core records, and for records that demonstrate compliance, which you have to do periodically, those have a retention of 0 after accreditation period ends or is renewed. We updated the training records item for law enforcement officers. So this we think is a better we created some sub items to break it up more reasonably. So it breaks it up into staff records, training materials records, which relate to core law enforcement, and training materials which address general public safety issues, and training materials from DCJS, and attendance lists. So each of those has different retention period based on what they are. And then we added a bunch of new items to cover programs that involve the community. And taking a look at the Monroe County Sheriff's Office website last night, it looks like these items will come in handy for you. So that includes the bike helmet inspection program records, community outreach and education program records, and ride-along program records. So if there are programs that you operate that we're missing, let us know and we can add those to the next version. Next slide. So for a long time, we have had an item which says blotter. There is no legal definition for blotter. And we found when we visited various law enforcement offices that each office had a different definition of what a blotter was. So we decided to clarify the item and remove reference to blotter. So basically, we are saying that, well, right now, law enforcement agencies have to file information with DCJS on incidents and activities. So if they do not share information or share records with DCJS, they would have to keep those records permanently. And so that would include what people may call blotters that are particularly older ones that predate 1950. If you are filing these records with DCJS and you are essentially holding on to a duplicate copy, then you'll be able to dispose of those records under the law enforcement reports item, or item 1221. We also received questions about what we meant by case closure. So we clarified that within the public safety section. So basically we say a case may be closed if it results in prosecution and appeals are exhausted. It results in a settlement. It results in no arrest, or when restitution is no longer sought. We also received a number of questions about, well, do I apply the retention period at the time of the arrest, or do I apply the retention period to the case at the time of the case closure? So we clarified that classification of a case investigation record should be based on the case's final disposition. So the crime or offense an individual is convicted of or pleads to. And we also added case closure to some items that didn't have it, just to clarify it. As many of you may know, there was a recent Child Victims Act that went into effect, and it effectively changed the statute of limitations on child sexual abuse crimes to age 28 in criminal cases and age 55 in civil cases. So we had to update the case investigation record item, and we added a subpart that covers these records. And the retention is 0 after child attains age 55 to meet that civil prosecution statute of limitations. We also added aggravated sexual abuse or course of sexual conduct against a child in the first degree to the case investigation record item. It essentially has no statute of limitations, like homicide has no statute of limitations. So it was added to that homicide subpart, and it has a permanent retention period. Next slide. We also wanted to make sure that there was consistency when we were talking about life expectancy. So basically, we updated items so that they all should have a consistent life expectancy retention period. We added a new item to cover photo requests for DMV photos, and the law sets that retention period at 5 years. We also revised the pistol permit item to include recertification, which is a fairly new requirement under the New York State SAFE Act. We also, this is a case of where we, as Sarah mentioned, we use legalese. So this has always been referred to as firearms, but we know that most people refer to this as pistol permits. So we added pistol permit to facilitate searching for this item. And we also added a sub item to this for incomplete applications, which has a 90-day retention period. We increased the retention period for traffic and parking violation records to 3 years. And we added a sub item to the alcohol and drug tests item to cover calibration and testing records for the equipment used to run those tests. And we based that largely on a similar item that we had that covers radar equipment. Next slide. I was actually surprised that we did not have an item to cover criminal background checks that police run for employment purposes. So we added that. I just want to make a distinction here. There is a missing persons item. There's actually 2 of them in the law enforcement or public safety section. There's one in the case investigation record, and that has a permanent retention period for missing persons that are not found and missing persons in which the which your organization is lead agency on that case. If your organization is not the lead agency, and you might be like helping out another department, there isn't a separate item in the public safety section that covers missing persons. And there was some confusion about why we had 2 separate references to missing persons. So we clarified when people should use this separate missing persons item. We also received a lot of questions about what's the retention period for license plate readers or body worn cameras or shot spotters, red light cameras, toll booth cameras, all of these new technology items. So we had been advising people to use an existing item, recordings taken from mobile units, but realized that some of these are stationary units. So we added and stationary, and we also added some examples. So people should be able to easily identify the item to use. And Sarah had pulled that up in her demo. We also added a new item to cover confidential information received, like through a tip hotline. And we added a new item to cover records where law enforcement provides transportation to people seeking admission to a hospital for mental health purposes. Next slide. So of interest to you may be the probation section. So I just wanted to just quickly go through these items. We met and spent some time with a county probation department, and most of these revisions are based on that meeting. We added a new item to cover sex offender records because we learned that these are maintained in addition to those found in client case files. We added a new item to cover lists of probationers and other clients, which we found were being submitted and received from DCJS. We added a new item to cover probation-related reports, studies, and queries, and we divided it into 4 types. Annual, quarterly or monthly, reports that have legal or fiscal value, and reports that have no legal or fiscal value. We learned that probation departments are largely using database applications to manage their client data. So even though our retention schedules are usually media neutral, there are occasions like with data systems where we will we'll add a specific section to cover those types of systems. And we did that in this case. But within this system retention period, there is one that covers the client data, and it has the same retention period as the case files item that existed already in this section and would cover paper files that a probation department may still maintain. Within the probation department case files item, we added a couple of sub items to cover testing for drugs or alcohol through the having the ignition locks. We learned that these 2 tests were part of the client file. Next slide. So as Sarah showed you, the LGS1 is a little over 400 pages long. Certainly no government is going to use every item within that schedule. And you'll probably, for most governments, you're only going to use a very small number of items. Maybe you're only using a couple of different sections. So we advise government organizations to develop an office schedule. And this office schedule provides basically a concise retention schedule that applies to your particular office. Usually it contains basic information that you would find in the LGS1. You know, things like the record series title, what the retention period is. You may even put information on when the record becomes inactive, and thus should be sent to your records room. You'll want to include the schedule item number, and you'll probably want to include where the record is located and maybe even have a comments field. And you would do that for each department or unit. What's nice about the office schedule is that this is a good place for documenting instances where you want to apply a longer retention period than the minimum retention period indicated in the LGS 1. Office schedules are really nice in that you can identify the record series that you're using by its common name. So, you know, we both mentioned, both Sarah and I, that the schedule tends to use legalese. So this allows you to identify the record by how you and your staff refer to it. Obviously, the retention schedule is going to indicate what the retention period is. Hopefully, by having a nice, concise schedule, it's something that makes it more easy for people to follow. And so more people will be involved in helping you implement records management. And it can also serve as a list of records for FOIL. So those of you involved in FOIL know that you need to create a subject matter list, and retention schedules are you know, what we've heard from our colleagues at the Committee on Open Government who administers FOIL. Retention schedules can serve as subject matter lists. So with that, I turn it back over to Sarah.
Awesome, thank you, Jennifer. So now that we know about our records and what we need to do to retain them, let's talk about storing those records. There are basically 3 linchpins of good record storage. You want that storage to be secure, you want it to be well organized, and you want it to be environmentally stable to protect the records that you are holding. And you really need all 3 of them to be successful for both paper and electronic. When it comes to your paper records, you really want to make sure that you're able to limit the access to those records to a certain number of people. So you want to make sure it's in a room with a locked door and you have limited access to keys. Because you don't want just anybody, particularly the records that you guys are going to be creating, wandering in there and rifling through the records, pulling out what they want, taking them back to their desks and losing them. You want to make sure that only a certain number of people can get in and out of the room and that you're tracking it. You want to make sure that you have some sort of sign out system. So if somebody goes in there to take out a box of records or even just a file, that they sign out that record, and so that you know where it went and when it left that space, so that, you know, if you get a FOIA request looking for that particular file, or you just need it because for a project you're working on, you can go, it's not where it's supposed to be, you can go, you can look it up, and you can go, oh, Henry took it out, you know, 2 weeks ago. Let's go up to Henry's desk and see if he still has it kicking around, which hopefully he does. You want to make sure that you're using fire resistant materials for your storage space and your filing cabinet. Filing cabinets, we'll talk about this a little more specificity, because you want to protect the records as best you can. You know, if there's a fire in your offices, if it gets to your records room, you know, you want to try to provide the best amount of protection for that you can. And to that end, you want to have security cameras and sprinkler systems in place to help protect those records. When it comes to your electronic records, however, you want to make sure that you're using server-based storage. It's not sufficient to use CDs, DVDs, thumb drives. Please don't use thumb drives to store your records. We're losing access to CDs and DVDs. I mean, when was the last time you bought a computer with a CD or a DVD drive in it, right? And thumb drives are just unreliable for long-term storage. You want to have these in server-based storage so that they have regular backups that you have of those records, so that if something happens to those drives, you can pull them back easily. Much like the paper record storage, you want to have regulated access to those records. Again, you don't want anybody just to be able to go in there and rifle through them and find whatever they want. You know, you want to make sure you know who's accessing the records and restricting that to the appropriate people. And you want to make sure that you have regular system maintenance and upgrades for your electronic records. I have seen far too many times in my career folks who get a system, they're super excited about it. It's really awesome. It's going to revolutionize their work. And they put all their records in it. And then they get a new system and it's super awesome and it's going to revolutionize their work. And they never migrate the records over. They don't update that system. They don't maintain it. And then they suddenly can't access those records anymore. And those records are actually important and they really need them to do their job. So if you haven't made friends with your IT department yet, please go make friends with your IT department. Bring them bagels, bring them cookies, bring them donuts, because you really want to have them on board and participating with you as you're managing your electronic records. You want to make sure that those records are well organized for your paper. That means that you have lateral filing cabinets or shelving for your active records. And we recommend 18 gauge 42 by 16 steel shelving for inactive records. I know that those wood shelves and bookcases and filing cabinets look really, really cool. I love them too, but they're not great for your records. They may not hold as much as they could possibly, so you're losing storage space. They catch on fire if there's a fire in there. They will soak up water if there's a flood. I've seen that happen a lot. And unfortunately, wood can attract pests. So you really want to have that steel shelving in there. You want to use consistent 1 foot storage, cubic foot storage boxes that are clearly labeled. Those are those banker boxes that we're also familiar with, because that regulated size will allow you to better estimate how much storage space you have and make the best use of the space that the shelving units that you have. And then you want to track those boxes with a database if possible. We have a sample access database that's super basic that you could use if you want. You can give us a holler and we'll send you a copy. So you know where the boxes are, when you receive them, how long you need to hold on to them. You can associate the retention period with them to help you better track and manage that record section so you know what you have and where it is and how long you need to have it for. With your electronic records, you want to use centralized storage. You want half of the files to be on Suzanne's PC, a bunch of them over on Jim's. There's a server over in the fiscal department that's got a bunch of miscellaneous stuff on it. You want to centralize it into a content management system or a well-organized local area network so that all the files are together and can be managed together, and you don't have to go hunting across all these systems and computers to find what you're looking for. You want clear, well-identified file naming conventions, particularly if you're going with something where you're storing all of your records in a local on your local area network and you're basically manually handling them. That way, the file name tells you what's in that file, and you don't have to open up every single one of them before you try to implement disposition on them. And it'll make it easier to find what you're looking for as you're going through those files. If at all humanly possible, implement audit trails. This is easier with a content management system to be sure, but you want to know who has access to what records, when they were placed there, who was in them, when they were edited, so you can see what's going on with those records to guarantee that they are authentic records. You do want to have an environmentally stable environment. The ideal situation is the temperature is going to be between 65 and 72 degrees. The humidity is going to be between 40 and 55%. You're going to have good air circulation. You're not going to have sunlight in the rooms because that's going to fade the records, particularly if you're dealing with paper ones. Well, that's only if you're dealing with paper ones, put shades over those windows. The big thing here is you want consistency. You don't want wild swings in the temperature and the humidity because that's going to significantly affect the quality of and the ability of your records to be maintained for the long term. So that environmentally stable environment is really important. As a rule of thumb, you really should be able to find a record within 3 minutes if you're dealing with paper, possibly even sooner if you're dealing with electronic. You want to have an up-to-date inventory with those records locations so you can find those records within 3 minutes. The inventory is going to be so helpful for you on so many levels. It can be used as that subject matter list for FOIL if you need it to. It tells you what you have and where, so you can do long-term planning with regard to records disposition, increasing your storage space. And here's the big one. A lot of folks want to digitize their paper records. That's what we get probably about 60% of our grants for. Having that inventory allows you to identify what records you have, so you can identify the records that are appropriate and necessary to digitize. Totally recommend having that inventory. It's really, really important. You want to have a clear, easy to use filing system that's consistent throughout the organization. You know, you want to make sure that everybody's singing the same song on that front. If you have records that should be indexed to increase access, minutes, for example, are a great example of this. You know, consider having those records indexed into a database, or, so that you can find what you're looking for faster. And then, you know, it might make sense to, you know, if there's records that should be digitized for ease of access, you know, evaluate them and consider digitizing them where appropriate. When it comes to your electronic records, you want to make sure that your files have clear logical names that are well-defined and understandable. This is very similar to your paper records, and that it's consistent across the board. It's going to make it easier to file those records. It's going to make it easier to find those records when you need to access them or dispose of them. If you're going to be on the local area network plan, you know, you don't have an automated content management system, you've got an awesome LAN that you can put all of your records on. Make sure that you have well-organized folders and subfolders, that they're named well and consistently, and that the files that are going in there are named well and consistently. We have a whole webinar on this. I totally recommend you, electronic records generally. I totally recommend that if this is your first dip into those waters, that you take an hour and watch it. Your electronic records should have some sort of search tools where you can, you know, keyword search for what you're looking for. If you can afford it, a content management system is going to be really helpful for automating records retention, potentially records retention, but the overall management of the records and access to those records. You guys are law enforcement, so there's extra considerations if you're looking at shared services, but a shared services plan is not necessarily a bad idea if you have one department that's got a really good savvy IT department. And other governments are, you know, still working on that. So it's, you know, that one government would host the content management system and everybody would have their records in that. And then again, work with IT, make friends with them. They're lovely people, even though they're probably stuck in the basement. As we're rolling up to the end here, because we are getting close, if you have questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Jennifer and I will be taking questions once I get done with the last part of this presentation. Are happy to answer any questions that we can. Although please remember that sometimes it does take us a little time to research some of the questions, particularly if they're a little involved. So if we do run across a question like that, we may ask you to email it to us after the fact, and we'll respond to you that way. All right. So records disposition. When you are disposing of your records, you know, the records have gone through the entire life cycle. They are at the end of their retention period. You can legally dispose of them. You want to make sure that you are documenting that you are disposing of those records, when you are disposing of those records, and what records you're disposing of. We do have a sample sheet that we can provide you so that you can use it to document your records destruction. There are a lot of ways you can get rid of your records. With paper, it's fairly straightforward. You know, you mostly want to shred or recycle them. The decision coming down to which one you want to use depends on the information on the records and whether or not it's something that you want to appear on the nightly news. When it comes to records with sensitive information on them, you probably want to go with a secure shredder. Stuff that doesn't really matter so much, you might want to you can probably recycle. When it comes to your electronic records, it's a little more challenging because you can't just hit the delete button and have your record be gone. It's still on the computer somewhere. You've just removed a link to it. Until that gets overwritten on the drive that it's stored on, it's still there. So there's a couple of ways you can do it. You can use specific software to wipe the hard drive to get rid of that information. You can use something that's called a degausser, which is basically a big giant magnet that'll erase your media. Or you can do my favorite, physically destroy removable media. Let me tell you, it is very, very cathartic to destroy a hard drive with a hammer. So you want to, look at the records you have and what media they're on and how you want to dispose of them before you make the decision. But just remember, you can't just hit that delete button and get rid of them. You really want to make sure that you're doing it in a very final manner. When it comes to preservation, if you're creating records, you really want to try to create them on a stable medium. So if you're creating records that are going to be permanent, maybe this is when you take the opportunity to purchase really good acid-free paper and use that for your physical records. If you're creating electronic records, and you can put them in a format that's considered a long-term standard like PDF or TIFF, consider creating them in PDFA, or TIFF, not just plain PDF. So that, they have the best chance of a long lifespan. Electronic records are challenging because there are some formats that don't really have a good equivalent for that, particularly if you need to have interactivity with them. PDF flattens everything. So do the best you can with that, and try to use common widespread formats. The more proprietary, the more niche format you use, the more difficult it is going to be to preserve that for the long term. For your records, you want to store them in that climate-controlled storage area, an archival vault. If they're permanent, they likely have some significant value to them. So you are probably going to want to make sure that they are well protected. You can still reformat to microfilm as a backup. Microfilm still is out there. It's still a valid backup format. I wouldn't use it as your first line of access. But if you're just dipping your toe into digitizing your records and you're not confident about your abilities to maintain the electronic copy for the long term, creating a microfilm backup of that is not a terrible idea. And have a plan for your migration plan for your electronic records. You can't just create an electronic record and let it go the way you can paper. You take a box of paper, you throw it in a climate-controlled vault for 70 years. It's still probably going to be pretty okay when you pull it back out, right? Electronic records, the technology changes so fast, you can't guarantee 10 years down the line that's still going to be true. It's not, there's some formats like, doc files, 10 years, I'll probably still be able to open them. They might have some issues, but I probably still be able to open them. But 20 years down the line, or, if it's a really niche format, think about how fast some of the CDs and DVD, some of the storage formats went. For example, who remembers zip drives? Who remembers jazz drives? They were here and gone in minutes, it felt like. And it's not simply enough to have a copy of the record. You have to be able to access a copy of the record. You have to be able to open that record and get to the information in it for the duration of its lifespan. And, for a 6-year record for your fiscal records, it's not such a big deal, right? 6 years, you should still be able to open it and access it. But what about 10 years, 20 years, those 55-year payroll records, which are going to be real important for retirement for a lot of people, for those permanent records related to the cases that you guys are investigating. In 100 years, do you think you can still access the format they're in currently? So you want to have that migration plan that looks at updating the format, the storage environment, the system that they're in, every 5 years at least anyway. Probably work with your IT to see what the appropriate window is for you. So this last couple of slides, let's talk about getting this program to work. So you've decided that we're going to manage our records appropriately. We've got some processes. We're going to be disposing of records using the retention schedule. We're going to go through this process to do that. We're going to use forms to document that we've disposed of the records. You want to write this down. Jennifer talked about, you don't have to destroy records at the end of the retention period if you've got a good reason. You want to write this down in your policies and procedures. Your policies are those general rules, those overall guidelines for the program, and the procedures are the step-by-step how you actually do things. You know, our policy for, you know, records retention is we're going to follow the LGS1, and then we're, you know, we're going to manage them in this certain environment, and we're going to dispose of them by following this process, filling out the disposition forms, and the procedures are the step-by-step instructions on how you to do all these things. Because if you document them, it makes your life so much easier. You don't have to go on an oral tradition of, well, how do I do this? Or try to remember, or it's already written down. And to that end, you want to make sure that you have trained staff on these policies and procedures when you've created them. Because staff are going to come up with their own policies and procedures if you do not give them to them. You know, if you want somebody to do something the way that you want them to do it, you have to train them on it. Otherwise, they will make up their own way. The nice thing about this is training your staff on your policies and procedures when they're new, when they're updated, you know, when it's been 6 months or a year and things are starting to go a little awry again, means that it reinforces records management within your organization that, hey, you know, this is important, this is how you do it, and hey, let's have a refresher training. One of the things we do really recommend, again, after anytime there's something new, anytime you've updated it, you know, letting staff know and training them on it. But when you hire new staff, part of their intake training is your records management policy and how they should appropriately manage those records so that they are doing it right from the start, that they're not getting bad advice from Linda over in accounting, you know, that they know exactly how they're supposed to be managing those records, and you don't have to deal with trying to get them together after the fact. And again, review those policies and procedures every couple of years, or anytime that you notice that something is going a little awry. So to recap, records management is important. It's really critical for you to be able to manage your records appropriately within your government. It's really the foundation of your program in a lot of ways, and is a responsibility of yours as government employees. And it's not just on the records management officer's back. There are a lot of things that everybody in your office can do to manage records appropriately. The LGS1, the retention schedule, is probably one of the key elements of managing your records. You know, it's like having that inventory, using the retention schedule, and having the policies and procedures to dispose of those records on a regular basis are really three of the big hallmarks of having a good records management program. So make sure that you are developing your program, that you are following along with the guidelines. Call the state archives if you need help. I'm here to help you. That's my job. That is literally my only job, is to help you guys as you have questions, need assistance on managing your records. And as Jennifer said, if I don't have an answer for you, I pester her or any of the hosts of the people at the state archives who can answer these questions for you. You know, if I don't have an answer, I've got Jennifer for retention. I've got folks over who are really good with electronic records. I've got folks who are really good with preservation at the state archives that I can ask questions to and find out an answer for you. So, you know, as you're working for this, you know, reach out to us, see what you want to do. If you're interested in our grant program, give me a holler. I can talk to you about that. The thing is to, you know, take this in small steps. You know, you're not going to implement this all at once. You know, you're going to want to have a plan, a timeline, and build it out in steps, but you can do this. I believe every single one of you has the ability to have a really awesome records management program if you don't already. Maybe I'm sure some of you have like absolutely stellar programs, and you can just tweak them a little bit and make them even better, but you can totally do this. So with that, if anybody has any questions, please let me, throw them in the chat. Jennifer and I are here until 12:30 to answer anything that you have to throw at us.
Sarah, so I see there's a question about in the retention schedule, it says that for case investigation records involving misdemeanors, we have a retention period of 5 years after close. But they want to know what happens if we get a record check for like a pistol permit 8 years later and they've gotten rid of the record. Well, we do have an item in the LGS one that I pointed out that would be like a summary of all of your cases, all of your incidents, and that has a permanent retention period if you're not filing that information with DCJS. So the GCJS system should also have a record of whether someone had, felony or misdemeanor conviction, or you may be able to find that information in court records too. So it seems like there's probably other sources of the information about whether someone was involved in a crime. So I think that addresses your question. There's also a question about, do you have a recommendation for disposing of electronic records? And it sounds like those records are in an active database.
Okay.
And this is actually a record or a question we get all the time. And that's why we really strongly encourage records management officers to be at the table when record systems are being designed to make sure that retention requirements are not overlooked when those records are being, or when those systems are being developed. Too often we see that retention requirements aren't kept in mind when the systems are designed, so that you end up with a situation like it sounds like you might be in now, where you can't easily destroy records once the retention requirements have been met. Oftentimes records are so tightly integrated with other data within that system that it's really impossible to extract the record at that point. So it's really important that you, as a records manager, are at the table making sure that records retention requirements are kept in mind when systems are in development.
Yeah, we can't stress that enough. If you can, at that point, build in the retention period, it just makes your life so much easier. But I know a lot of people are in situations these days where they, who knew, right? And you are facing databases that have a lot of different record series in them. You are definitely going to want to talk to your IT department about what options are available and take a look at the database and how the information in it is structured and see if the information can be extracted easily and disposed of. Otherwise, you end up in a situation where you kind of look at what's called big bucket scheduling, where you end up holding the database and all of the information in it until the longest retention for the records in that system have passed. So say you have a system that has 6-year records in it, 10-year records in it, and 55-year records in it. And you have to keep the 55-year records, and there's no way to get any of that data out. You end up holding onto those records, even the 6 and 10-year records, until that 55-year retention is passed for the last 55-year record is in there. And then you can dispose of all of them at that time. If you end up doing that, I strongly recommend that you document that in your policy somewhere and say, this is what our decision was on that front. So that if anybody questions what happened here, why do you still have these records when you're disposing of all of your other records, regularly, you can explain what went on. And, y'all are going to play the lottery. You're going to win. You're going to win fabulous amounts of money. You're going to go to Aruba, right? And somebody's going to take your position behind you. You want to leave clear documentation for them so they understand what happened and what was going on. So if somebody questions them about why you have this database, you can explain that to them as well.
So there's another question about how are other agencies receiving information regarding the court disposition of a case to determine the retention. And we have heard from others that they're having some challenges with getting information from the courts about case closure. We did reach out to our colleagues at the Office of Court Administration, and I'm struggling to remember what they said, but it sounds like courts are not compelled to share that information. So it's a difficult situation, and I may be wrong in saying that. My memory may be failing me, but I know that there are complications in communicating this information from the courts to others that need to know this information. So I think this is an area where we're hoping that we can maybe open up a dialogue with the unified court system and see if we can figure something out. It may be that we may need to reconsider the case closure as a retention event. So if you have ideas on maybe an alternate solution or an alternate retention event that we could use, we're certainly open to any suggestions.
Hey, this is Mateo. I actually had a question for you guys.
Sure.
So say you have a body camera clip come in, and its retention lifespan is set. What would happen if it was edited and redacted? Would the lifespan of the redacted clip be the same as the original?
So I mean, I guess it depends on your policies and procedures and whether the redacted version became part of like your attorney's case files or something like that. So it depends on what was done with it. But if you were making maybe a redacted copy to share with a member of the public, maybe through a FOIL request, then I would think that that record would essentially be a duplicate copy, and you would keep it probably as long as you would follow the FOIL retention period, which I think is like 6 months. So, your FOIL response, which would likely include that video clip, would be kept for 6 months. So it kind of depends. If you're just creating it as an access copy, but you haven't like used it to respond to a request, then you could consider it a duplicate copy and just destroy it when no longer needed. So it really depends on the function of it and what you're using it for.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Any other questions from folks?
I think that's going to be it, guys.
All right. Well,
Awesome.
thank you. Thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you.
Yeah, of course. You guys did an excellent job, and we have to thank you both very much. We're grateful for everything that you do over at the New York State Archives. And on that note, I also want to thank everybody who came out to attend. We appreciated the questions, and we hope you guys learned a lot.